Some mysteries slip through the fingers like mist, intangible, deceptive, always one step ahead. And for Tommy and Tuppence, failure was not just an inconvenience, it was an insult to their very profession. Tommy Beresford was not pleased with life. In fact, he was fuming, though he masked it well behind a forced air of nonchalance, nursing a cocktail at the Grand Adlington Hotel. The sting of failure was fresh. Blunt's brilliant detectives, their much-touted agency, had suffered an embarrassing setback. They had been summoned to Adlington Hall to crack the case of a stolen pearl necklace. A case that should have been a feather in their cap. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. While Tommy, disguised as a Roman Catholic priest, had been tailing a gambling countess with all the precision of a seasoned sleuth, and Tuppence had charmed her way into the good graces of a wealthy heir over golf, the local police inspector had coolly and effortlessly solved the mystery before them. The thief, not some cunning mastermind, nor a shadowy figure lurking in the corridors of aristocracy, just a second footman, a well-known criminal who confessed with a shrug. The case had closed before Tommy and Tuppence could even make their grand deduction, and so, with bruised pride but heads held high, they had retreated, seeking solace in cocktails and the dim glow of hotel chandeliers. Tommy, still clad in his clerical disguise, tapped his umbrella absently against the table. He sighed, swirling his drink. "Not exactly a Father Brown moment, was it?" he muttered. "And yet I had the perfect umbrella for the role." Tuppence smirked. "It wasn't a Father Brown kind of mystery. You need the right atmosphere, something perfectly ordinary, and then all of a sudden, the bizarre begins creeping in. That's how it works." Tommy lifted his glass with a resigned air. "Well, we're heading back to London. Maybe something bizarre will happen on the way to the station." He barely had time to take a sip before a heavy hand landed on his shoulder with a force that nearly sent the glass flying. A booming voice followed, filled with exuberant familiarity. "Well, I'll be damned, if it isn't old Tommy, and Mrs. Tommy too. Where the devil have you two been hiding?" Tommy blinked in surprise, then turned. The voice belonged to a man with a broad, beaming face, the kind of face that never seemed to stop grinning. Square-shouldered, dressed in golfing attire, his presence was as loud as his voice. "Bulger," Tommy exclaimed, setting down his glass. Good old Bulger, Mervyn Escourt, better known as Bulger, was an old acquaintance, a larger-than-life personality, whose enthusiasm filled the space around him. "But I say, old chap," Bulger went on, eyes twinkling, "I never knew you'd taken orders. Fancy you a blinking parson." At this Tuppence burst into laughter, while Tommy looked momentarily sheepish, and then just as suddenly, they became aware of a fourth presence. She stood slightly apart, but her aura was impossible to ignore. A woman of striking beauty, the kind that turned heads and silenced rooms, tall and slender, with impossibly golden hair cascading over the rich black of her fur-trimmed coat. She exuded an air of wealth and mystery. Her round blue eyes, large and knowing, observed them with an amused smile. The pearls at her ears gleamed under the soft lighting, and there was something about her presence, an almost theatrical elegance, as if she had stepped out of a different world altogether. Who was she? And why did it feel as though somehow the atmosphere had shifted, just enough to signal that perhaps something bizarre was about to happen after all? And her smile said many things. It asserted, for instance, that she knew perfectly well that she herself was the thing best worth looking at, certainly in England, and possibly in the whole world. She was not vain about it in any way, but she just knew with certainty and confidence that it was so. Both Tommy and Tuppence recognized her immediately. They had seen her 3 times in The Secret of the Heart, and an equal number of times in that other great success, Pillars of Fire, and in innumerable other plays. There was perhaps no other actress in England who had so firm a hold on the British public as Miss Gilda Glenn. She was reported to be the most beautiful woman in England. It was also rumored that she was the stupidest. Old friends of mine, Miss Glenn, said Escort, with a tinge of apology in his voice for having presumed, even for a moment, to forget such a radiant creature. Tommy, and Mrs. Tommy, let me introduce you to Miss Gilda Glenn. The ring of pride in his voice was unmistakable. By merely being seen in his company, Miss Glenn had conferred great glory upon him. The actress was staring with frank interest at Tommy. "Are you really a priest?" she asked. "A Roman Catholic priest, I mean, because I thought they didn't have wives." Escort went off in a boom of laughter again. "That's good," he exploded. "You sly dog, Tommy. Glad he hasn't renounced you, Mrs. Tommy, with all the rest of the pomps and vanities." Gilda Glenn took not the faintest notice of him. She continued to stare at Tommy with puzzled eyes. "Are you a priest?" she demanded. "Very few of us are what we seem to be," said Tommy gently. "My profession is not unlike that of a priest. I don't give absolution, but I listen to confessions." "Don't you listen to him," interrupted Escort. "He's pulling your leg. If you're not a clergyman, I don't see why you're dressed up like one," she puzzled. "That is, unless not a criminal flying from justice," said Tommy. "The other thing." "Oh," she frowned, and looked at him with beautiful bewildered eyes. "I wonder if she'll ever get that," thought Tommy to himself. "Not unless I put it in words of one syllable for her, I should say." Aloud he said, "Know anything about the trains back to town, Bulger? We've got to be pushing for home. How far is it to the station?" 10 minutes walk, but no hurry. Next train up is the 6.35, and it's only about 20 to 6 now. You've just missed one. Which way is it to the station from here?" "Sharp to the left when you turn out of the hotel." "Then let me see, down Morgan's Avenue would be the best way, wouldn't it?" Morgan's Avenue. Miss Glenn started violently, and stared at him with startled eyes. "I know what you're thinking of," said Escort, laughing. "The Ghost." Morgan's Avenue is bounded by the cemetery on one side, and tradition has it that a policeman who met his death by violence gets up and walks on his old beat up and down Morgan's Avenue. A spook policeman, can you beat it? But lots of people swear to having seen him. "A policeman," said Miss Glenn. She shivered a little. "But there aren't really any ghosts, are there? I mean, there aren't such things." She got up, folding her wrap tight around her. "Goodbye," she said vaguely. She had ignored Tuppence completely throughout, and now she did not even glance in her direction. But over her shoulder she threw one puzzled, questioning glance at Tommy. Just as she got to the door, she encountered a tall man with grey hair and a puffy red face who uttered an exclamation of surprise. His hand on her arm, he led her through the doorway, talking in an animated fashion. "Beautiful creature, isn't she?" said Escort. "Brains of a rabbit. Rumor has it that she's going to marry Lord Leconbury." That was Leconbury in the doorway. "He doesn't look a very nice sort of man to marry," remarked Tuppence. Escort shrugged his shoulders. "A title has a kind of glamour still, I suppose," he said. "And Leconbury is not an impoverished peer by any means. She'll be in clover. Nobody knows where she sprang from. Pretty near the gutter, I dare say. There's something deuced mysterious about her being down here anyway. She's not staying at the hotel, and when I tried to find out where she was staying, she snubbed me quite crudely, in the only way she knows. Blessed if I know what it's all about." He glanced at his watch and uttered an exclamation. "I must be off. Jolly glad to have seen you two again. We must have a bust in town together some night. So long." He hurried away, and as he did so a page approached with a note on a salver. The note was unaddressed. "But it's for you, sir," he said to Tommy. "From Miss Gilda Glenn." Tommy tore it open and read it with some curiosity. Inside were a few lines written in a straggling, untidy hand. "I'm not sure, but I think you might be able to help me, and you'll be going that way to the station. Could you be at the White House, Morgan's Avenue, at 10 minutes past 6? Yours sincerely, Gilda Glenn. Tommy nodded to the page who departed, and then handed the note to Tuppence. Extraordinary, said Tuppence. Is it because she still thinks you're a priest? No, said Tommy thoughtfully. I should say it's because she's at last taken in that I'm not one. Hullo, what's this? This was a young man with flaming red hair, a pugnacious jaw and appallingly shabby clothes. He had walked into the room and was now striding up and down muttering to himself. Hell, said the red-haired man, loudly and forcibly. That's what I say, hell. He dropped into a chair near the young couple and stared at them moodily. Damn all women, that's what I say, said the young man, eyeing Tuppence ferociously. All right, kick up a row if you like. Have me turned out of the hotel. It won't be for the first time. Why shouldn't we say what we think? Why should we go about bottling up our feelings and smirking and saying things exactly like everyone else? I don't feel pleasant and polite. I feel like getting hold of someone round the throat and gradually choking them to death. He paused. Any particular person? Asked Tuppence. Or just anybody? One particular person, said the young man grimly. This is very interesting, said Tuppence. Won't you tell us some more? My name's Riley, said the red-haired man. James Riley, you may have heard it. I wrote a little volume of pacifist poems, good stuff, although I say so. Pacifist poems, said Tuppence. Yes, why not? Demanded Mr. Riley belligerently. Oh, nothing, said Tuppence hastily. I'm for peace all the time, said Mr. Riley fiercely. To hell with war. And women. Did you see that creature who was trailing around here just now? Gilda Glenn, she calls herself. Gilda Glenn. God, how I've worshipped that woman. And I'll tell you this, if she's got a heart at all, it's on my side. She cared once for me, and I could make her care again. And if she sells herself to that muck heap Leconbury, well, God help her, I'd as soon kill her with my own hands. And on this suddenly he rose and rushed from the room. Tommy raised his eyebrows. A somewhat excitable gentleman, he murmured. Well, Tuppence, shall we start? A fine mist was coming up as they emerged from the hotel into the cool outer air. Obeying escort's directions, they turned sharp to the left, and in a few minutes they came to a turning labeled Morgan's Avenue. The mist had increased. It was soft and white, and hurried past them in little eddying drifts. To their left was the high wall of the cemetery, on their right a row of small houses. Presently these ceased, and a high hedge took their place. Tommy, said Tuppence, I'm beginning to feel jumpy. The mist and the silence, as though we were miles from anywhere. One does feel like that, agreed Tommy. All alone in the world. It's the effect of the mist, and not being able to see ahead of one. Tuppence nodded. Just our footsteps echoing on the pavement. What's that? What's what? I thought I heard other footsteps behind us. You'll be seeing the ghost in a minute if you work yourself up like this, said Tommy kindly. Don't be so nervy. Are you afraid the spook policeman will lay his hand on your shoulder? Tuppence emitted a shrill squeal. Don't, Tommy. Now you've put it into my head. She craned her head back over her shoulder, trying to peer into the white veil that was wrapped all round them. There they are again, she whispered. No, they're in front now. Oh, Tommy, don't say you can't hear them. I do hear something. Yes, it's footsteps behind us. Somebody else walking this way to catch the train. I wonder. He stopped suddenly, and stood still, and Tuppence gave a gasp. For the curtain of mist in front of them suddenly parted in the most artificial manner, and there, not 20 feet away, a gigantic policeman suddenly appeared as though materialized out of the fog. 1 minute he was not there, the next minute he was so, at least it seemed to the rather superheated imaginations of the two watchers. Then as the mist rolled back still more, a little scene appeared as though set on a stage. The big blue policeman, a scarlet pillar box, and on the right of the road the outlines of a white house. "Red, white and blue," said Tommy. "It's damned pictorial. Come on, Tuppence, there's nothing to be afraid of." For, as he had already seen, the policeman was a real policeman, and moreover, he was not nearly so gigantic as he had at first seemed looming up out of the mist. But as they started forward, footsteps came from behind them. A man passed them, hurrying along. He turned in at the gate of the White House, ascended the steps and beat a deafening tattoo upon the knocker. He was admitted just as they reached the spot where the policeman was standing staring after him. "There's a gentleman seems to be in a hurry," commented the policeman. He spoke in a slow reflective voice, as of one whose thoughts took some time to mature. "He's the sort of gentleman always would be in a hurry," remarked Tommy. The policeman's stare, slow and rather suspicious, came round to rest on his face. "Friend of yours?" he demanded, and there was distinct suspicion now in his voice. "No," said Tommy. "He's not a friend of mine, but I happen to know who he is. Name of Riley." "Ah," said the policeman. "Well, I'd better be getting along. Can you tell me where the White House is?" asked Tommy. The constable jerked his head sideways. "This is it, Mrs. Honeycott's." He paused and added, evidently with the idea of giving them valuable information. "Nervous party, always suspecting burglars is around. Always asking me to have a look around the place. Middle-aged women get like that." "Middle-aged, eh?" said Tommy. "Do you happen to know if there's a young lady staying there?" "A young lady," said the policeman, ruminating. "A young lady, no, I can't say I know anything about that." "She mayn't be staying here, Tommy," said Tuppence. "And anyway, she mayn't be here yet. She could only have started just before we did." "Ah," said the policeman suddenly. "Now that I call it to mind, a young lady did go in at this gate. I saw her as I was coming up the road." "About 3 or 4 minutes ago it might be, with ermine furs on?" asked Tuppence eagerly. "She had some kind of white rabbit round her throat," admitted the policeman. Tuppence smiled. The policeman went on in the direction from which they had just come, and they prepared to enter the gate of the White House. Suddenly a faint muffled cry sounded from inside the house, and almost immediately afterwards the front door opened, and James Riley came rushing down the steps. His face was white and twisted, and his eyes glared in front of him unseeingly. He staggered like a drunken man. He passed Tommy and Tuppence as though he did not see them, muttering to himself with a kind of dreadful repetition, "My God, oh my God." He clutched at the gate post as though to steady himself, and then, as though animated by sudden panic, he raced off down the road as hard as he could go in the opposite direction to that taken by the policeman. Tommy and Tuppence stared at each other in bewilderment. "Well," said Tommy, "something's happened in that house to scare our friend Riley pretty badly." Tuppence drew her finger absently across the gate post. "He must have put his hand on some wet red paint somewhere," she said idly. Said Tommy. "I think we'd better go inside rather quickly. I don't understand this business." In the doorway of the house, a white-capped maid-servant was standing, almost speechless with indignation. "Did you ever see the likes of that now, father?" she burst out as Tommy ascended the steps. "That fellow comes here, asks for the young lady, rushes upstairs without how or by your leave. She lets out a screech like a wild cat, and what wonder, poor pretty dear, and straightway he comes rushing down again, with the white face on him like one who's seen a ghost. What will be the meaning of it all? Who are you talking with at the front door, Ellen?" demanded a sharp voice from the interior of the hall. "Here's Mrs.," said Ellen, somewhat unnecessarily. She drew back, and Tommy found himself confronting a grey-haired middle-aged woman, with frosty blue eyes imperfectly concealed by pince-nez, and a spare figure clad in black with bugle trimming. "Mrs. Honeycott," said Tommy. "I came here to see Miss Glenn." Mrs. Honeycott gave him a sharp glance, then went on to Tuppence and took in every detail of her appearance. "Oh, you did you?" she said. "Well, you'd better come inside." She led the way into the hall, and along it into a room at the back of the house facing on the garden. It was a fair-sized room, but looked smaller than it was, owing to the large amount of chairs and tables crowded into it. A big fire burned in the grate, and a chintz-covered sofa stood at one side of it. The wallpaper was a small grey stripe with a festoon of roses round the top. Quantities of engravings and oil paintings covered the walls. It was a room almost impossible to associate with the expensive personality of Miss Gilder Glenn. "Sit down," said Mrs. Honeycott. "To begin with, you'll excuse me if I say I don't hold with the Roman Catholic religion. Never did I think to see a Roman Catholic priest in my house. But if Gilder's gone over to the Scarlet Woman, it's only what's to be expected in a life like hers, and I dare say it might be worse. She mightn't have any religion at all. I should think more of Roman Catholics if their priests were married. I always speak my mind. And to think of those convents, quantities of beautiful young girls shut up there, and no one knowing what becomes of them, well, it won't bear thinking about." Mrs. Honeycott came to a full stop, and drew a deep breath. Without entering upon a defense of the celibacy of the priesthood or the other controversial points touched upon, Tommy went straight to the point. "I understand, Mrs. Honeycott, that Miss Glenn is in this house." "She is. Mind you, I don't approve. Marriage is marriage and your husband's your husband. As you make your bed, so you must lie on it." "I don't quite understand," began Tommy, bewildered. "I thought as much. That's the reason I brought you in here. You can go up to Gilder after I've spoken my mind. She came to me after all these years, think of it, and asked me to help her. Wanted me to see this man and persuade him to agree to a divorce. I told her straight out I'd have nothing whatever to do with it. Divorce is sinful, but I couldn't refuse my own sister shelter in my house, could I now?" "Your sister?" exclaimed Tommy. "Yes, Gilder's my sister. Didn't she tell you?" Tommy stared at her open-mouthed. The thing seemed fantastically impossible. Then he remembered that the angelic beauty of Gilder Glenn had been in evidence for many years. He had been taken to see her act as quite a small boy. Yes, it was possible after all, but what a piquant contrast. So it was from this lower middle-class respectability that Gilder Glenn had sprung. How well she had guarded her secret. "I am not yet quite clear," he said. "Your sister is married. Ran away to be married as a girl of 17, said Miss Honeycott succinctly. "Some common fellow far below her in station, and our father a reverend. It was a disgrace. Then she left her husband and went on the stage, play acting. I've never been inside a theater in my life. I hold no truck with wickedness. Now after all these years, she wants to divorce the man, means to marry some big wig, I suppose. But her husband's standing firm not to be bullied, and not to be bribed. I admire him for it." "What is his name?" asked Tommy suddenly. "That's an extraordinary thing now, but I can't remember. It's nearly 20 years ago, remember, since I heard it. My father forbade it to be mentioned, and I've refused to discuss the matter with Gilder. She knows what I think, and that's enough for her. It wasn't Riley, was it? Might have been, I really can't say. It's gone clean out of my head. The man I mean was here just now. That man, I thought he was an escaped lunatic. I'd been in the kitchen giving orders to Ellen. I'd just got back into this room, and was wondering whether Gilder had come in yet. She has a latch key when I heard her. She hesitated a minute or two in the hall, and then went straight upstairs. About 3 minutes later, all this tremendous rat-tatting began. I went out into the hall, and just saw a man rushing upstairs. Then there was a sort of cry upstairs, and presently down he came again and rushed out like a madman. Pretty goings-on." Tommy rose. "Mrs. Honeycott, let us go upstairs at once. I am afraid." "What of?" "Afraid that you have no red wet paint in the house." Mrs. Honeycott stared at him. "Of course I haven't. That is what I feared," said Tommy gravely. "Please let us go to your sister's room at once." Momentarily silenced, Mrs. Honeycott led the way. They caught a glimpse of Ellen in the hall, backing hastily into one of the rooms. Mrs. Honeycott opened the first door at the top of the stairs. Tommy and Tuppence entered close behind her. Suddenly she gave a gasp and fell back. A motionless figure in black and ermine lay stretched on the sofa. The face was untouched, a beautiful soulless face like a mature child asleep. The wound was on the side of the head. A heavy blow with some blunt instrument had crushed in the skull. Blood was dripping slowly onto the floor, but the wound itself had long since ceased to bleed. Tommy examined the prostrate figure, his face very white. So, he said at last, he didn't strangle her after all. What do you mean? Who? Cried Mrs. Honeycott. Is she dead? Oh yes, Mrs. Honeycott, she's dead, murdered. The question is, by whom? Not that it is much of a question. Funny for all his ranting words, I didn't think the fellow had got it in him. He paused a minute, then turned to Tuppence with decision. Will you go out and get a policeman or ring up the police station from somewhere? Tuppence nodded. She too was very white. Tommy led Mrs. Honeycott downstairs again. I don't want there to be any mistake about this, he said. Do you know exactly what time it was when your sister came in? Yes, I do, said Mrs. Honeycott, because I was just setting the clock on 5 minutes as I have to do every evening. It gains just 5 minutes a day. It was exactly 8 minutes past 6 by my watch, and that never loses or gains a second. Tommy nodded. That agreed perfectly with the policeman's story. He had seen the woman with the white furs go in at the gate. Probably 3 minutes had elapsed before he and Tuppence had reached the same spot. He had glanced at his own watch then, and had noted that it was just 1 minute after the time of their appointment. There was just the faint chance that someone might have been waiting for Gilda Glenn in the room upstairs. But if so, he must still be hiding in the house. No one but James Riley had left it. He ran upstairs and made a quick but efficient search of the premises. But there was no one concealed anywhere. Then he spoke to Ellen. After breaking the news to her, and waiting for her first lamentations and invocations to the saints to have exhausted themselves, he asked a few questions. Had anyone come to the house that afternoon, asking for Miss Glenn? No one whatsoever. Had she herself been upstairs at all that evening? Yes, she'd gone up at 6 o'clock as usual to draw the curtains, or it might have been a few minutes after 6. Anyway, it was just before that wild fellow come breaking the knocker down. She'd run downstairs to answer the door, and him a black-hearted murderer at the time. Tommy let it go at that. But he still felt a curious pity for Riley, an unwillingness to believe the worst of him. And yet there was no one else who could have murdered Gilda Glenn. Mrs. Honeycott and Ellen had been the only 2 people in the house. He heard voices in the hall, and went out to find Tuppence and the policeman from the beat outside. The latter had produced a notebook, and a rather blunt pencil which he licked surreptitiously. He went upstairs and surveyed the victim stolidly, merely remarking that if he was to touch anything the inspector would give him beans. He listened to all Mrs. Honeycott's hysterical outbursts and confused explanations, and occasionally he wrote something down. His presence was calming and soothing. Tommy finally got him alone for a minute or 2 on the steps outside, ere he departed to telephone headquarters. Look here, said Tommy, you saw the deceased turning in at the gate, you say. Are you sure she was alone? Oh, she was alone all right. Nobody with her. And between that time and when you met us, nobody came out of the gate. Not a soul. You'd have seen them if they had. In course I should. Nobody come out till that wild chap did. The majesty of the law moved portentously down the steps and paused by the white gate post which bore the imprint of a hand in red. Kind of amateur he must have been, he said pityingly, to leave a thing like that. Then he swung out into the road. It was the day after the crime. Tommy and Tuppence were still at the Grand Hotel, but Tommy had thought it prudent to discard his clerical disguise. James Riley had been apprehended, and was in custody. His solicitor, Mr. Marvell, had just finished a lengthy conversation with Tommy on the subject of the crime. I never would have believed it of James Riley, he said simply. He's always been a man of violent speech, but that's all. Tommy nodded. If you disperse energy in speech, it doesn't leave you too much over for action. What I realize is that I shall be one of the principal witnesses against him. That conversation he had with me just before the crime was particularly damning. And in spite of everything, I like the man, and if there was anyone else to suspect, I should believe him to be innocent. What's his own story? The solicitor pursed up his lips. He declares that he found her lying there dead. But that's impossible, of course. He's using the first lie that comes into his head. Because if he happened to be speaking the truth, it would mean that our garrulous Mrs. Honeycott committed the crime, and that is fantastic. Yes, he must have done it. The maid heard her cry out, remember. The maid, yes. Tommy was silent a moment. Then he said thoughtfully, what credulous creatures we are really. We believe evidence as though it were gospel truth. And what is it ready? Only the impressions conveyed to the mind by the senses, and suppose they're the wrong impressions. The lawyer shrugged his shoulders. Oh, we all know that there are unreliable witnesses, witnesses who remember more and more as time goes on, with no real intention to deceive. I don't mean only that. I mean all of us. We say things that aren't really so, and never know that we've done so. For instance, both you and I, without doubt, have said some time or other there's the post. Tommy leaned forward, his eyes suddenly gleaming with the excitement of a revelation that had just struck him like lightning. He tapped the table with his fingers, as if trying to piece together the scattered fragments of a puzzle that had eluded him until this very moment. You see, Tuppence, he said, his voice low but intense, we always assume things based on what we expect to hear. A door slams, we think someone has entered. A knock on the door, we believe someone is outside waiting to come in. But what if we're looking at it from the wrong end? Tuppence frowned, her brows knitting together as she tried to follow his train of thought. What do you mean, Tommy? It's all about perception, Tommy continued. A stick, for example, one end points in one direction, but flip it around, and the other end points the opposite way. It's all about how you look at it. Doors open, but they also shut. People go upstairs, but they also come downstairs. And boxes, well, they close, but they also open. It's all a matter of perspective. Mr. Marvell, who had been listening with growing confusion, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. You're speaking in riddles, Tommy. Get to the point. Tommy's voice grew sharper, more certain. Let's go back to that night. We were so sure that Miss Glenn had entered the house at that exact moment. Why? Because we heard a sound that we assumed was her coming in. But what if it wasn't? What if instead, it was someone leaving? A chill ran down Tuppence's spine. But Miss Glenn never went out, Tommy. We know that. Tommy nodded. Exactly. She didn't. But someone else did. The murderer. Silence gripped them all. The weight of his words settled heavily in the air. But Tommy, Tuppence whispered, her voice laced with doubt. How did she get in then? The door was shut. Tommy exhaled, leaning back slightly. She entered the house when Mrs. Honeycott was in the kitchen, talking to Ellen. They were deep in conversation, preoccupied. They never heard the front door open and close. By the time Mrs. Honeycott returned to the drawing room, she assumed Miss Glenn hadn't arrived yet. But then as she was fixing the clock, she heard what she thought was her sister entering and going upstairs. Tuppence's mind raced. And that wasn't her. Tommy shook his head. No, that was Ellen. She was going upstairs to draw the curtains. And remember what Mrs. Honeycott said. That her sister paused before going up. That pause was just enough time for Ellen to step out of the kitchen and into the hall. She was seconds away from seeing the killer, but just missed him. A shudder ran through Tuppence, and the scream. Tommy's lips curled into a grim smile. That wasn't Miss Glenn. That was James Riley. His voice is naturally high-pitched. Didn't you notice? In moments of extreme shock, even men's voices can rise into a sharp, almost feminine cry. It wasn't Gilda Glenn who screamed. It was Riley, reacting to what he saw. And the murderer? Where was he? Tommy's expression darkened. Right in front of us. We spoke to him, Tuppence. We stood there, oblivious, as he calmly played his part, hiding in plain sight. Realization dawned in Tuppence's eyes. The policeman. Tommy nodded grimly. That's why he appeared so suddenly. He stepped out from behind the gate just as the mist cleared. It startled us, remember, but we never suspected him, because we never think of policemen as suspects. We see them as figures of authority, of law and order, but at the end of the day, they are men, just like anyone else. They love, they hate, and sometimes they kill. Tuppence swallowed hard. You mean Gilda Glenn saw her husband outside that night? She took him inside to talk, to reason with him. But he wasn't a man of words, Tommy finished, his voice edged with certainty. He wasn't like Riley, who could explode with anger and let it out in violent arguments. No, this man was quiet, cold, controlled, and when the rage took hold of him, he didn't yell, he didn't fight, he just saw red, and he had his truncheon in his hand, a weapon no one would ever question. A heavy silence fell over the room as the truth settled like a thick fog, suffocating and inescapable. The policeman, the one who had stood among them, who had nodded solemnly and played his part, had been the killer all along, and they had never seen it coming.